And so, I think there's been this a trope for a long time about education. Education is the key to success. It is the ticket out of poverty. I think this is something that's been there for a long time. And I always feel kind of strange pushing back against that because I deeply love public education. I think it is key to, if you define success as being a well-rounded human being. But I think, you could have a great school, but if in your area, the economy is not producing living wage jobs, it's actually not a ticket out of poverty. Do you think, it's not about educating your way to success? Do you think, the last few years of, political change, the growth of the left plus this pandemic, do you think that it's changed that narrative at all? Or are people kind of doubling down on this idea that, well, everything can be solved through education, just educate your way to the top? Has that changed at all, or has this stayed the same?
I mean, I would love to tell you it's changed, but I'm not seeing it here. Unfortunately, it's the same old thing rolled out. And I mean, that's why they want to reopen schools, right? Because,
Right.
it's improving kids' futures and all those things. Yeah, I don't know. I want to be more positive, but I'm not seeing any change.
I think it depends on where you're at and what you're listening to and seeing, right? So like in lefty spaces, I do see that, right? With the the heightened awareness and consciousness of, getting that degree and then having this student debt, that's out there now, right? So like it's our path to debt. It's not our path to actual American dream success. That doesn't exist anymore. And I think that narrative is getting out there, right? Like both through Bernie, God love Bernie, and, all the work he's doing. And then when it comes like here in this space, in this very red space, when we talk about unemployment and, that narrative right now, and people are like, oh, you don't want to work. And, it's finally being revealed like, hey, those wages are not livable wages. And so like I see those conversations, but I never see it tied back to like public education, so I like see this narrative, but I don't see a correlation between like, we need public schools to, boost our education to get us to the next thing. When people are like, yo man, I don't want to get a degree because I don't want to end up in debt for the rest of my life and not be able to afford a house. That's what I hear more of. Right. Yeah. So I don't know. Noticings.
I think that's a really big change though, because the idea, obviously the great equalizer idea, something that's pretty entrenched in the foundations of our schools. And yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to quantify, but I do think there's a difference between the rhetoric that's being used by Biden and those around him, from Obama calling schools the best anti-poverty program in the world. I'm not sure I've heard that kind of language used. Not that it won't be. Like I said, I think we're pretty early on. Yeah, but I do think that what you just mentioned is really kind of a beginning of a huge change.
Sometimes when I'm feeling particularly morbid, I'll take a look at the salaries of blue collar union workers in my area that don't require a college degree, and I'm like, I'm such a sucker. Like, why did I do that again? And so for the next question, so Jane and Rebecca, you all were leaders in the Red for Ed teacher strike wave, and I think it's kind of hard to believe, but that was 3 years ago, which I don't know if that feels like a long time ago or a short time ago, but and you can't, at least for me personally, overstate like how much of a ray of hope that that strike movement was, and I think it really changed a lot of aspects of politics. So first, I mean, can you both kind of just remind people like what happened in your states, like how many teachers went on strike, what did you all win, and then I think, what is the state of things now? Like, how is that movement reverberated? Have teacher, I mean, COVID's kind of changed the game, but even before COVID, like, have teachers been able to use that to start going on the offensive in some ways, or is it more still in the mode of fending off attacks? And I guess reflections of, now that it's a few years away, like, just how would you assess that overall movement? Sorry, that's a lot, but
Well, since I copied Jay, he should go first.
Sheesh. Yeah. So, yeah, Paul, 3 years ago, it in some ways it seems like it was hardly any time. In other ways, it seems like it was ages ago with everything that's happened. But yeah, I mean, here in West Virginia, we ended up having a statewide teacher and education service personnel strike in February of 2018. And we kind of call it, you might have heard it called 55 Strong or 55 United, because we have 55 countywide school districts here, and we were on strike for 9 days. Ours really started off centered around our healthcare. We have kind of a state-sponsored healthcare plan here that had just been getting cut year after year after year, and it was going to have some really egregious cuts go through, and that's kind of what pushed everyone into striking. Strikes are illegal in West Virginia, and so that was kind of a big step, but we had such good unity from both teachers and service workers at schools and across the state that illegality didn't really matter, because we had such power with everybody standing together. So we were on strike for 9 days, and about halfway through that, on the fourth day, was when we were told to go back a couple days later, and a deal had been struck, and the rank and file kind of said, wait, what? You didn't ask me. No, that's not the deal. And so we ended up staying out for 9 days total. Ended up getting a 5% raise, both for teachers and for all state employees. So even people who didn't go on strike with us got paid. I think you were asking numbers. I think it was about 32,000 people were on strike throughout, because it shut down every district in the entire state and every kind of employee for that district. It was a really powerful, kind of amazing time. And I don't know, I never, in the moment here, we weren't thinking about kind of sparking a movement that would go across the country. We were really just thinking about saving our healthcare, really. But it spread after that, and it was amazing to see. And I loved watching, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Arizona, what was going on there. And I was really impressed by Arizona, because they had, in my opinion, much less of a union infrastructure to start with. And they kind of created their own and just really did something powerful. So yeah, that's my segue to you, Rebecca.
Well, we did borrow a few of your tricks, PS, so thanks for going first. So here, and just for context, I moved here in 2017, July of 2017. And so when you think of like the mood and the tone here, when I moved here, it had already been like a decade of demoralization, right? Like there was just this feeling, even when I walked on my campus, of just like, well, that's the way it is. We don't ruffle the waves. We just don't, and I was like, well, what about this? Like, what about this? And everyone's like, no, you don't say things. And I was like, what? I came from Chicago Teachers Union. I have a different view. Okay. And what I realized is the demoralization was real. The union busting was very real, even in my district, which was thankfully one of the most progressive districts. And I had full support of my superintendent. He'd pop into my classroom and say, keep going. What do you need? Just super supportive. And that wasn't always the case. There was a lot of union busting. And if you're even part of the union, you may be blacklisted or called out or, even fired. And so there was just tone here, right? Just really not worker friendly, not union friendly. And then when you look at the education statistics, we're dead last, bottom of the barrel for all of the statistics: per pupil funding, salary for both elementary and high school, counselor ratio. I explained that already. Our average is 900 to 1. The, recommended is 250 to 1. So we were 903 to 1. And class size, we have the highest class sizes in the nation. I had to teach science with 34 kids in the room. I had never done that before. I always had classes of like 25 in Chicago. So it was just, as someone who had just come into this space, it was the worst working conditions I personally had experienced. By the time I got here, I was 13 years in education already. And so think of working conditions aside, what goes on at the legislature was intentional and aggressive defunding of public education. We are number one for charters, number one for vouchers, ESAs, STOs, you name it. If it's an ALEC copycat model legislation, it's here, and this is the playground, right? They test all those model legislation here. And so what that happened is there's the funding formula here is different, and that's part of the puzzle. But why were teachers so demoralized was really the salary, right? Last in the nation, and over since 2008, they had cut funding. They had cut over $1 billion in funding so that people's net pay, even though insurance was going up, retirement was going up, they were taking home less money every year. And the cycle just continued to the point where paychecks were $900 biweekly. And so what was the trigger, though? The trigger that led, besides West Virginia as a catalyst, the trigger was our legislative session starts in January every year. The governor said he was going to give educators a 2% raise, and that's it. And the year prior, in 2017, there were a couple Republican legislators that said, oh, teachers are overpaid. They have boats. And I mean, the memes of the boats and everything was just unbelievable, just like total mockery. It was just disgusting. And so people were angry about those boat comments the year before, thinking teachers have enough money to actually buy a boat. And then the 2% raise. So while the 2% raise came out, West Virginia was happening, right? So think January, okay, February, then little Kentucky, Oklahoma. And so by March, people here, you could just feel it. We're just feeling like we have to do something. Why aren't we doing this? And I had that feeling too. And I ended up connecting with Jay O'Neill on the Badass Teachers Association page when Lois Weiner posted, what state's going to be next? She posted an article about West Virginia. And I was like, I wish it was AZ, sigh. And Jay O'Neill swoops in and he goes, you can do it. Dan DiMaggio from Labor Notes comes in and says, you can do it. Here's some resources. Read this book from Chicago. And I was like, hey, Dan, I'm from Chicago. I think he was just blown away. So anyway, what I'm saying is it was so demoralized that it wasn't about firing people up. The issues were already widely and deeply felt. It was more about how do you take that and manifest it and mold it into like this movement that we built. And we did it very strategically. We built our own infrastructure outside of the union in a grassroots style. We built a network, both online and in person. So we had a combination of those things. And we built our 5 demands. And those 5 demands were really a 20% raise, no new tax cuts, putting funding back to 2008 levels, basically give us $1 billion. And then salary increases, competitive wages for everybody, just like West Virginia, right? That whole wall-to-wall concept, give, competitive wages for all our brothers and sisters, like the certified and classified. And so we built this movement. We asked people to volunteer. We called them liaisons. Yep. And ended up, we built an 8-week escalating plan. And we ended up with over 2,000 volunteer liaisons, which functioned as site reps who would map their workplaces. We would give them tasks, actions, feedback tools, structure tests, all those things. And we had people positioned in over 1,200 schools. And that's how we built power. That's how we built that power and ended up there 8 weeks later. And so how many people? Well, by the time, so when you think of the numbers, only about one third, between 25 and 30% of educators, there's 60,000 here, were dues paying members. So that's about, 30,000 people, 20,000 people. So 1/3 of 60 were dues paying. The other 2/3 were not dues paying members, yet we plugged them into structures like labor formations that weren't there before. And we brought them into the movement and said, we need you to do this. And so when all is said and done, there were 57,000 people who were both union and non-union. That's a really big thing. I don't think a lot of people realize that took a strike authorization vote. So we shut down almost every I think there were just a pocket full of districts that did not go on strike. We had 854,000 students, I think is the number, in the 800,000s that were out of school. And so it was a very massive, massive labor action. And our wins, we ended up getting a 20% raise over 3 years. It was called the 20 by 20 2020 plan, but it came with strings attached, of course, where it only went to teachers of record, so homeroom teachers. So if I'm a music teacher, PE, I don't have a homeroom. Guess what? They divided us. They made us share the pot with everybody else. And of course, we're going to do it. And most districts shared the pot. So there, depending on which district you were in, some folks did get a 20% raise, but that is not very common and did not happen everywhere. And so another major win is it came out to be about $434 million into the budget that year. So thank you, West Virginia.
The way you described how that started, it kind of sounded like a superhero movie. So any lefty filmmakers will have to make that. And to follow up with you, I mean, because obviously funding is so critical here. So you, Rebecca, were part of an effort for a successful ballot initiative, Proposition 208 in Arizona, which taxed the rich to fund public education. Can you just, talk a little bit about that and what kind of role do you see for progressive revenue in saving public education?
Well, yeah. So what was great about our infrastructure that we built is we used it, right? We pivoted right to a ballot initiative and they knocked it down in 2018, but we still had infrastructure. We still had relationships with, coalitions and all the things. And that was good because we still activate that, now. And so even in a pandemic, we got over 437,000 signatures for this initiative to tax the 1%. And so we're just going back to the way it was, right? When you think of the tax cuts and the tax cuts and the tax cuts, like the pie gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So the only way you could ever fund education is by making the pie bigger, right? Basic budget here. And so a sales tax that had been put into place a couple years prior. There was a different prop. And so there's been like various props over time. There was Prop 301, which, led to our evaluations and test scores and would get us an extra boost. And then there was a penny sales tax kind of thing. And what we know is those kinds of taxes are regressive and they affect the lower income people more. So when you poll around things like that, you realize taxing the rich is really popular. So you go with it. And so we miraculously, in the middle of a pandemic, won, right? 52-48. It was incredible. And now they're trying to take it away. It's in court right now. And the legislature, as I wrote in that article with Ben Fong, a credible activist here, is, we can do all these progressive funding things, right? And it's great because this is the way to do it. We're righting the wrong. Back in the day, that percentage for wealthy folks was actually higher, right? And it's been lowered and lowered and lowered over time. So we're really just going back to the way it was. And what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So like you may get these things passed like we are right now, but there's ways to combat it. And the legislature is now building out a new tax code for these 1%ers to try to block that money from coming. It's just, I feel like I can't make this stuff up, right? And that's just the way it is. But we all have to try because it is popular and it is the way to grow the pie. We're not going to fund education unless we grow the pie. That's it. You can't. So it has to be done.
Yeah, definitely. And everyone should check out the article she wrote with Ben Fong. I know they're posting it in the live chat, so definitely make sure you read that. Kind of comparing what happened there in California with a similar measure that lost narrowly. So I think for the last question, I'll kind of end on a kind of a corny, hopeful question. Maybe I'll start with you, Megan. How would you lay out, if we're in a social society, what would education look like to you?
I love corny questions with hope. I think, actually going back to what we were talking about with the Soviet Union schools early on, in the early 20s. What strikes me about those schools, so when budgets were cut, and because the only money that existed was going towards supplying people's fundamental basic needs. Parents banded together, and they had felt so invested in those schools that they continued running them as educational institutions, not just as like food pickup places, which is what they were going to be. They bought supplies. And likewise, there's a system of schools in northern Italy in the Emilia-Romagna province called the Reggio Emilia schools. And these are schools that arose from literally the rubble of World War II. All of the schools in the whole region were decimated, and they were kind of started, parents and teachers were kind of starting from scratch. And probably not shockingly, the curriculum is really similar to the Soviet schools I described, and to not incidentally a lot of the private schools here in the United States. Again, like real life problem solving, project-based learning. The spaces that kids are in are beautiful, and that's something I think about every day as a teacher. Is my first year of teaching, I like tripped and injured myself on literally crumbling parts of the building. My kids referred to the food that they ate as trash. And these are like fifth graders talking about chicken nuggets that they're being served. And what is it like to go to school every day and to be fed trash and to exist in these buildings that are literally crumbling? But the Reggio Emilia schools are funded. They're part of the civic culture, and they actually have the parents there today, and the teachers actually have places in like as policy advisors as part of the government, the local government. So they get a lot of financial support because they're really important to people, because they draw on the knowledge of parents and of children, which I think is really the most fundamentally important thing to do in schools. Teachers are just partners in kids' learning. Not to belittle that, it's really important, but yeah, I think putting children as part of the central part of education, social emotional learning, which is going to become even more important than it's ever been after COVID. We're going to need more and more counselors and more health professionals, and not this fake austerity that's being implemented now. So I think just the bottom line for me is like, what would a socialist education look like? It would be child-centered. It would be about documenting kids learning through actually like this happens in Reggio Emilia, through actually like keeping artifacts of work and looking at their growth, and assessing their projects and how they exist in the world, as opposed to like having them fill out a standardized test. Again, project-based learning, work that is authentic and meaningful and respected for what it is, and not for preparation for college or the jobs of the future. That's not technical training. What I think is really profound about the Soviet schools that I mentioned earlier is that we're talking about a society that was like rapidly industrializing, but they insisted that schools were places where children learn together in collaboration and pursue work that is meaningful to them, and not prepare for the factory floor. And I think that values both the kids' perspective and their worlds, and the workers having control over their own technical training, which then goes on in the workplace and not in schools. Yeah.
All right. Jay, have any thoughts?
I mean, I think they'd be well funded. I mean, I'll just start with that. Like Megan was talking about, I mean, take school food, right? Like it's terrible. And crumbling buildings. I mean, I'm having to put 2 box fans in my windows every morning. I put them in, just to have better ventilation because of COVID. Like, I think in a real socialist society and in a place that really valued education, none of this would be an issue. You wouldn't have 900 to 1, counselor to student ratios. You'd have a counselor for every grade level. I don't have a full-time nurse in my school. This year during COVID, do not have a full-time nurse. I mean, all of that stuff would be huge. And I think we could really start to implement different kinds of learning in the classroom if we had the resources we need. I think sometimes I teach middle school, so I deal with discipline a lot. And I think sometimes about discipline issues, that how things could be taken care of so differently if we had more resources to help, rather than just, sending a kid to the principal's office or whatever. If we had more intervention, more social workers, more people to really look after all aspects of their lives, I think so much more learning could go on within the school building. But right now, we're making do with so little. So I guess if I could sum it up, my vision, I'm just going to start at the basics, just more funding. Let's actually, if we believe that schools are the great equalizers, like, Obama and everybody likes to talk about, then let's put money towards that and let's actually support it.
Yeah, every year I have an assignment where students list 5 demands for education and a strategy for getting them, and school lunch is always at the top, always at the top. So Rebecca, I think you'll get the last words.
Megan, I sit here and I connect with everything you say because my own children go to Montessori and I am a constructivist educator. I believe fully, I'm very familiar with Reggio Emilia because when I was looking for schools for my own children to go to, that was something I came upon. And so and I'm a science educator, I'm a hands-on, not just inquiry. I'm not just asking you to look at something in direct observations and go from there. It's constructivist. I construct my knowledge, right? And I'm going to do the thinking and apply it and maybe use some place-based phenomena, right? That's a big thing in science these days, where we study the things and the cultures and the values, and we apply things we learn through this science, approach, this 3-dimensional approach to instruction, which is the new thing with the new standards that exist across the nation. And it is powerful to have students really collaborate, work together, work on projects, work on these things, figure out the world around us instead of having front-loading direct instruction, where kids discover, inquire, we layer in vocabulary as needing. So for me, like in my ideal world and like where I seek for my own children to go is an approach to education that is that way, where they are, able to choose what they want to, study and look at, work with others, then teach others. And it's really just more of a community-based culture where we think about place-based phenomena and how what we view in our cultures and values has a place in our minds and how we think about science. So like I'm a science person, so like that's how I think, but none of that will happen unless we get educators to move away from teaching to the test. And the way you do that is by getting rid of the tests and providing actual instruction down to the pre-service level of like this front-loading gradual release of responsibility. I do, you do, we do garbage is not how people learn. There's literally a book called How People Learn that describes the constructivist approach and how we're doing it wrong. And so I think we all need to step back and say, get rid of this testing stuff. Yes, school food and the culture and the buildings and the funding is all important. But until we as educators look at education as something different than the way we learned, maybe, those of us who've been in here for a while, it's not about me front loading, you receiving that information and regurgitating it back. Why are we doing this? This is not how we learn. And for me, the ideal situation would be shifting the entire culture of teaching to something that is more constructivist and follows those same principles and ideas that Megan was describing. That would be ideal for me.
Can I just say one more thing? Is there time?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So my first year teaching, I it had all of these values, but I totally taught to the test because I was afraid and I had no other experience of how to do anything else. And there were no people, no mentors to look to. So I agree. The word culture that you use, the whole culture of teaching needs to change. But also, I think, you know, if you've been looking at those Reggio Emilia programs, that whole idea was transferred over to the United States, but they cost like $30,000 here, you know, so we can do the things, but we really need the money to fund it. And it's really, really hard to do it on an individual level in an individual classroom. I mean, I think in the past few years, I've gotten much, much closer to being able to teach to my values and in that constructivist way, but it is so difficult to do it without a whole community of people to mentor and to work together towards it. It's a huge undertaking. I think the most important one.
All right. Well, I think that's a great place to end it. So Rebecca, Megan, Jay, thank you so much for coming on. This was great. And I hope we can have you back again soon.